Our next speaker, also having a fireside chat with me, is Kyle Poyar from OpenView. So if you've been following him on social media, LinkedIn, Twitter, his writings on blogs, this guy is prolific and deep insight, deep thoughts into how companies should be doing their pricing, big proponent of product-led growth. Kyle, welcome.
Thanks for having me. Good to join you.
Yeah, it's my pleasure, man. So let's kick off right away with SaaS pricing. So in your experience, what do you say? How are most SaaS companies figuring out their pricing plan? How are they determining what's the value metric?
Great question. So it varies a lot over the life cycle of companies. You get a lot more data over time around your customers, how they use the product, what they value, what your competitive landscape looks like. Maybe I'll talk through what are the things to look for. And so first off, I saw there was a question from the previous speaker around how do you set the price for your product when you're launching. To me, the value metric, or the metric that kind of determines how much you charge or how much a given customer pays, that's a lot more important to get right early on than the exact price point. You can do a lot to experiment with the price point. Your product's going to get more robust over time, allowing you to capture more of that value you're creating. But it's a lot harder to change the unit of measure that you're using in your pricing. So when I think about the metric itself, I'm looking for a few factors. First is that it needs to align with how customers see value in your product. And that sounds simple, but it can be challenging to actually figure out what are the best metrics that do really correlate. And so you might think about HubSpot as an example. Folks know their marketing automation software. It kind of makes sense that they charge you more as you generate more marketing contacts that you have in HubSpot and that you want to send emails to. You might not realize they didn't initially start that way. They initially charged on a per user basis. They had no notion of marketing contacts. They had very little expansion revenue. And then they had to go through the process and really figure out, hey, is it contacts? Is it number of emails people are sending? Is it amount of revenue they're able to generate? What is the right metric? But ultimately concluded that contacts was really aligned with the value people saw, specifically when they used HubSpot, and aligned with their objectives. So customers were trying to be successful and generate more contacts to grow their own business. So that's like first and foremost. Other things I look for are, is it flexible, where folks can, it allows you to land folks at a fairly attractive price point, so people don't have to spend all of the potential at once. They can bite off, maybe it's for a team, a business unit, a project basis, allows you to kind of land a customer fairly smoothly. And then is it scalable so that you get more spend as your customers are growing and if they're successful with your product? If you think about like cell phone plans, they used to charge you based on how many minutes you talked or how many text messages you send. But realizing that those metrics aren't growing. And so if they charge that way, those metrics are going to lead them to get less and less revenue over time. And they move towards gigabytes of data. Since data consumption is going through the roof, it's a lot more scalable from a monetization standpoint. Then two other things are like predictable and then feasible for you to implement. I think the predictability side, enterprises care about it, but it's something that's important to make sure you have some predictability for your customers. And then you have to be able to meter it, to be able to share the data with customers around how much they're consuming of a certain metric. So that feasibility piece can't be just an afterthought.
So if you currently charge per seat, or maybe you have buckets of 1 to 10 and 10 to whatever, then you want to switch to usage-based pricing, and making that change can be scary. Like, what if we make less money? So how would you manage that switch and alleviate your fears?
Yeah, well, it's a great question. I'd say like the first thing I think about is usage-based. Is a usage-based model better in the long run for both you and your customers? And I think that there have been a lot of fears historically about usage-based pricing. folks thought, hey, investors will value it because it's not as predictable. It's not kind of fixed recurring revenue. That fear has gone away. I think Snowflake and AWS are two examples that show the market might even value usage models more than subscription models. It means there's no shelfware in the business, and it tends to correlate with more net retention. So first kind of thing is there an opportunity for your business? You can look at, hey, are customers asking for it? Are we having some customers that have really high usage, but not a whole lot of users, and so we're really underpaying versus the value that we're delivering? Are competitors offering usage models? Like, really look at the customer base, your competitive landscape. And then I think that there's, when you think about usage-based pricing, or at least in my mind, it does tend to coincide with probably less revenue from a customer upfront, but more of a lifetime value because you're operating on more of a land and expand basis. And so I think the other thing to just be mindful of is, do your investors have the appetite for it? Do you have the capital to play that sort of patient long game? And then realize there might be an initial short-term hit if your customers downgrade into certain usage plans and certain customers spend less. You might have to have the like internal fortitude to take some of that short-term hit, knowing that it's going to be healthier long-term for both you and your customers. And I think we haven't seen a whole lot of companies doing that, but New Relic is a great example where they launched a usage model about a year ago. They had a couple of terrible, frankly, quarters as they migrated their existing customers and right-sized them on plans, and now usage is sort of back up. Revenue growth is heading in the right direction. And but it's not trivial to kind of get through that hump in order to get to the other side.
And I'm guessing it's also maybe not the best case for every type of customer. So I'm thinking, let's say Coursera, so it's online content, it's taking courses. So what's the usage? Like, how often do you complete a lesson or a course? And we know in e-learning, that's the big problem they have, is like people making time for learning because it's never urgent. And so if they would switch away from like just get access to how many lessons per month or whatever, they'd probably be out of business.
Yeah, it's a fair point. I think for me, the usage should correspond with a positive business outcome so that you're sharing in the customer success. And ideally, there's a positive ROI every time the customer is making that, is sort of performing that action, doing that usage. So with HubSpot, they're not going to try to get fewer contacts to market to. The marketing team is never going to try to do that just because they're paying more for HubSpot in order to achieve that. And so you really need that metric of usage to correspond with something the customer cares about is trying to increase. That's why payments revenue is almost like the holy grail of usage-based pricing, because you're sharing immediately in what the customer cares about, which is generating more revenue for their business. And they can almost treat it as just sort of a cost of goods sold or operating cost rather than a fixed expense that they have to budget towards. But I think you called out the right things. You don't want to have a metric that's too discretionary, where the customer is constantly choosing whether or not to consume the product and might not necessarily see an ROI for doing it. It's also tough if if usage is highly variable or episodic with an account, or if you're trying to have a push product where you kind of constantly need to drive engagement, and you need your customers to drive engagement within their companies. It's easier if there's a pull product where that's kind of constantly bringing you back into the app itself.
So if one were to, want to make the switch to a usage-based model, so what are the strategies to determine the best usage metric? Anything besides just common sense that, hey, they want to increase their emails or?
Yeah, so I mean, first thing is just even brainstorming as a leadership team. What are the different metrics that that indicate how much your customer uses of your product? And no ideas are bad. You should include users alongside of those other metrics. They're normally metrics that you're already tracking internally to measure the health of your business. If you are a product-led business, they might even include like your North Star metrics of like what are the key things that you're looking at that indicate health of an account in terms of product adoption and stickiness. I normally come up with about, call it 8 to 10 metrics. So, and that's more internal driven process. Then you run them through those 5 criteria I mentioned. And looking at essentially like, hey, if we were to score these metrics on these criteria, are there any that totally fail? Like we can't actually implement, we can't monitor these metrics, we rely on the customers telling us data, or this actually doesn't correspond with value. Our best customers use less of this metric than our mediocre customers. So you start scoring them through, and then you kind of end up with about 3 or 4 high potential metrics. And those are things that you want to do more diligence on. I think you can ask customers about them. There's some techniques that I use to do that that I'm happy to talk through. But you want to talk to your customers about it. And then you also want to look at your existing data to look at, for example, like correlations between how much folks have spent historically and how much they use of the product to show that there seems to be some like directional likelihood with willingness to pay. Or are high usage folks with certain metrics more likely to renew and expand their spend over time than low usage folks? Those are, and actually generally, what's the cohort growth like within an account? So we have one portfolio company that had seen about 120, 130% net dollar retention, but their usage metrics were growing 200, 250, 300% within an account in that first year. And so their usage was growing way faster than spend was growing. And that's part of what got them sort of conviction that these specific metrics that were growing really quickly would be a better metric to kind of orient their pricing around.
Thank you very much. And how would you then design to accelerate revenue growth? If you have switched to a usage-based model, you want people to do more of that, whatever the action is. Any tips there?
Well, it kind of requires a company-wide change. Like folks ask me, like, what roles do you need in a usage-based company? And I think of it as like it's the kind of core roles and org structure that a typical SaaS business would have. But everyone's mindset changes and the activities that they're doing changes. So customer success needs to be a mindset in these companies rather than just a job. And in fact, with a usage model, in theory, folks could stop using the product at any time, which means that they basically stop spending at any time. And so you're constantly at risk of having your customers churn, but it's also really seamless for them to spend more as they consume more of the product. So generally, you're looking at your product team isn't just focused on net new features, but you have people that are carved out looking at usability, making sure the product is super easy to use, intuitive, has collaboration capabilities so that more folks are exposed to the product in an account, where you're really minimizing any friction for people consuming the product. Sounds like a no-brainer, but a lot of product doors are not set up with that kind of mindset or team right now. Your marketing team might need to do a lot more education that's connected to the product. And so rather than just classic demand gen, maybe they're teaching customers about different use cases. Maybe they're building a community around best practices for how to consume your product so that marketing actually has a goal around driving more education, more success with your product, and ultimately more adoption over time. That even can extend to your sales team. And so you might look for folks that are more technical or product minded in selling. You're not necessarily trying to get customers to commit to the highest level of spend possible, but rather doing things that align with customer success, like offering trials or proof of concepts for the customer to kind of see success in initial use case. And then reps, for instance, tend to get a tail in comp. So they're not just comped on the upfront amount that they can land with the customer, but the overall spend of that customer over time. So your sales folks are like literally incentivized to stay with that customer and make sure that that customer is adopting the product and expanding to more and more teams and use cases that could see value from it. And so this kind of mindset applies really across the organization. Could even talk about other examples if you're interested, but really it's a company-wide job to drive adoption. But the good news is that you're creating an extremely customer-centric business model where everyone in your company is leading to kind of better NPS, better outcomes for your customers.
Yeah, totally. I absolutely see. So your incentives are aligned. Both want the same thing, as opposed to, like sales. Let's just close deals, and get the money in. So yeah, so that's beautiful. So does that mean that the customer success org needs to be bigger, or as you said, then everybody needs to act more like customer success in a sense?
Yeah, it's a great question. It varies a lot company to company. Some folks like an AWS or a Snowflake might have their reps stay with their book of business for kind of in perpetuity. And so the reps even act in some ways like customer success. Other businesses, they do have a fairly robust CS org that makes sure that customers are being successful in the product. I don't think they're normally that much bigger than traditional SaaS businesses, but what I would say it's different here. Generally, folks are more generous with support, even for free users or low-paying users. You don't always know which of your users is going to see great results in your product and have their spend take off. Like you might imagine a Twilio, and you could have a 10-employee business that starts off on Twilio from a messaging standpoint, and all of a sudden they're spending thousands, if not millions of dollars in a couple of years. And so you kind of want to be in that model. You want to be really generous on support so that folks can get up and running, even if they're not spending a whole lot today. And then the other thing is that your customer success team is generally looking at patterns around what led to your most successful customers and trying to take those lessons and apply those early on in the journey for your new cohorts. So it might be things like, hey, we found that customers that set up an integration with Slack or that set up XYZ dashboards tend to have really great adoption characteristics. They're really focused on making sure customers hit those milestones early on. And so that those first 3 months, first 6 months in a customer's life cycle are extremely critical to long-term health.
Okay, this sounds awesome, and I'm totally on board. But have you seen this like backfiring in a scenario where like companies went ahead with good intentions? We're going to be all about customer value, and then it didn't work. Anything that comes to mind?
You mean I see this as it's a business model change rather than a pricing change. And so I have seen companies introduce like a usage-based or pay-as-you-go plan, but they don't actually change any ways that they operate as a business. And then they're surprised that they're not seeing the outcomes that they're looking for. But in general, there's not a whole lot of kind of major failures. And the reason is because there's been a lot of hesitancy among companies around changing their pricing model in the first place. And so we think we're still in the early innings of businesses pivoting towards usage-based pricing. And what tends to happen is you kind of start that way, and more companies are starting usage-based. And then if they maybe launch a new product, maybe that new product is usage-based. But we haven't seen that many kind of legacy companies trying to overhaul their business model. Reality is it's so hard to do it successfully that scares people from making the jump.
So I'm also guessing in order to align incentives, how does it work with if you have a sales team? So like they get their commissions based on the usage, or?
In some cases, yeah. So it varies company to company. I'd say New Relic is a great example because they've been really public about this transition. They've been doing it for about a year. Totally changed their business model towards usage-based pricing and product-led growth. And with sales comp, they had to kind of go back to the drawing board on it rather than focusing on how much ARR did that sales rep book with a new customer in the first year, and did they book a 2-year or 3-year agreement? They're now looking at actual consumption behavior And so they pay out their reps based on the realized consumption of customers. And that creates a kind of good incentive where reps are trying to do what's in the best interest of a customer. If that customer wants to make a bigger commitment and get a discount, off their future spend, that's great. Like, that's in their best interest. But sales is pushing them to do that before they're ready, and they're kind of acting as someone that really is only caring about that customer, doing what's kind of in that best interest of their long-term health as a customer of the product.
And tell me about product-led growth and freemium tiers here. So is your recommendation then to just base it on the usage metric and up, like in MailChimp, first 500 emails is free, and or what's your take here?
Yeah, I guess first comment is that I'm a big proponent of free offerings, free trials. I think, as I look at companies, even my own background, I used to, as someone that works in the world of pricing, I used to have a lot of concerns around free hurting the value perception of the product, or being a distraction, or leading to cannibalization where folks that might have otherwise paid now can get by with just the free version. But to me, that mindset has completely changed, and I'm now a huge proponent of it. And I think that when we looked at what happened in COVID as just a really interesting case study here, there were so many companies that realized their demand fell off a cliff in Q2 of last year, and they needed to do something to get people engaged in the sales funnel. And so, dozens and dozens of companies started introducing free versions of their product, and companies that had never done that before in their history. And they tended to realize this was extremely successful. Pluralsight ran a free April campaign. I think they generated over 1 million signups, and they called it their best, most successful marketing campaign they had run in the history of the business. And so folks realized that this is an incredible way to kind of accelerate your marketing efforts and decrease sort of the amount of, basically get customers earlier on in the funnel, allow them to try out the product, be successful with it, and then sell into them from a position of strength. It's almost like if your customer is, if you're going to a clothing store trying out a pair of jeans, you're going to buy it if they look good. But if you just walk by them, you're just going to be like, oh, those are a nice pair of jeans, but not necessarily talk to the person on the sales floor to buy them. So all that said, how to actually design a free offering. I tend to like to be generous with the capabilities that you offer. You want to offer a free experience that is that it's something that's a robust, like enterprise grade experience of your product. You don't want to make it like a single user only version that has really limited features, because then people will just assume that your product sucks in general. They won't upgrade to the next tier because you haven't earned their permission to do that. And so I like to be generous on features, generous on users, but cap it on certain usage limits. And what that allows you to do is allows you to get the customer successful, see value, reach their aha moment in the product, and then there's a real paywall or compelling event when they know now's the time I need to take out my credit card and buy. I think Slack is probably the poster child of a great example of this, where they allow anyone within an account to sign up for Slack. Often it's sort of an individual or a team starts using Slack and then realize Slack's pretty boring if it's just a couple people, so invite more and more people to join. And then at some point, Slack goes from this place where folks are sort of chatting with their friends at work to a place where your work is actually happening, mission critical business information lives, and that's where they hit you with their usage limit around the amount of data and messages that you can store in the app. And you realize, hey, I need to unlock this. I need to be able to have access to this on an ongoing basis. But at that time, you really understand how success, like how great the product is, and it's really hard to take it away from these users that are really enjoying the product itself.
Brilliant. A couple of questions also from the attendees here. So Luis is, these are all things that you have already mentioned to some extent. So unpredictability of revenue. can you are there any benchmarks, or can you do any sort of easy modeling to predict what the revenue might be?
Yeah, so in terms of predictability, so you'll develop more predictability over time as you have more customers using the product. I think with even your beta customers, you can look at their historical usage patterns in the app to have a sense of, hey, are there seasonal spikes? What does the usage look like on a cohort basis? And really, it's a matter of getting smarter and smarter about leveraging the data you have around customer consumption to better predict things going forward. And so if you look at like a Snowflake or some of the top usage-based companies, their FP&A teams have to predict to Wall Street what the revenue is going to look like for future quarters, and the revenue is consumption driven. And so they have to look at things like at an individual customer level, at a understanding where they are in terms of their journey and on a cohort basis, their use case, their industry. They're really trying to start getting really good at forecasting what they think that usage will look like going forward. And so it's a process in getting less wrong over time, based on how you're observing characteristics around your existing customers. But I personally think I wouldn't let that fear of unpredictability stop you from doing usage-based pricing. A lot of folks realize that on the aggregate, usage across all of your customers tend to actually behave fairly predictably. Even if on a customer by customer instance, it might be fairly variable. And then I think the other thing I would share here is that it's not a binary, like I go seat-based subscriptions or purely usage-based pay as you go. There are gray areas, and one thing that we're seeing in our portfolio is companies having a base subscription fee and then usage-based on top, so that they have that predictable subscription revenue component and then that variable component that could scale up over time as the customer is successful in the product.
Yeah, you've written quite a bit about usage-based pricing. Is there a resource you'd recommend if somebody wants to, start implementing it? Any link to share with the audience?
Yeah, I'll put a link here. Highly recommend folks check out our usage-based pricing playbook. We interviewed the top companies that have a usage-based pricing model and compiled all those insights. So I'll drop that in the chat.
Amazing.
It covers everything from financial metrics, how to operate, go-to-market strategy, sales comp, you name it.
Boom. Kyle, thank you so much. It's been a pleasure. I learned a lot, inspired. Thank you.
Thanks for having me.